Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Governor Jesse Ventura. Jesse Ventura was the governor there of Minnesota there for 4 years to stint, and of course we know him best really because of the truth television programs that he put out over a couple of years. Some of the most revealing television of modern times. I don't know how it ever got on nationwide television, but a tremendous following. We're going to be talking to Governor Ventura about his the recent book. It's called 63 Documents the Government Doesn't Want You to Read. Governor, thank you so very much for being with us tonight.
Hi, Stan. Nice to be with you tonight.
Well, why don't you sort of just take us along the way my wife said I was not to talk. I was just to let you talk because you have so much and so many documents here. And, of course, this is simply a compilation of the information that has been actively suppressed in the United States. You pick up the story, and believe me, this will be a friendly interview. Not one of those hostile interviews I've seen so many that you've had, but you always handle yourself so well. Anyway, we appreciate everything you do.
Well, thank you, Stan. Well, this book came about really as piggybacking off my last book, which was American Conspiracies. And, of course, in that book, we took the conspiratorial side of all the conspiracies and showed evidence that mainstream media ignores and things like that, and really in many of the conspiracies virtually showed that there's probably more credible evidence supporting the conspiracy than there is the theory or whatever you want to call it that the government puts forward or the official story. But Dick Russell, my co-writer, and I, of course, we took a lot of grief for it. You get labeled, you're called a conspiracy theorist, and all these nice names they come up with for you, and they tell you you're crazy and you've lost your credibility and all that. So we figured we'd follow it up with a book that they couldn't denounce from us, that they couldn't question it. And it, of course, is 63 documents the government doesn't want you to read. And we actually started this book 3 to 4 months before the WikiLeaks broke. So when that broke, we were overjoyed because it gave us access to even more information and more documents. I want to state all the documents in here are in the public sector. We stole nothing. We broke no laws. You just have to know where to find them, and that's where my co-writer Dick Russell comes in so well. He's a phenomenal researcher. He finds the documents, and I, of course, then read and write on them. But we work very well as a team. And the documents are, as I did this book, it was not a pleasing book to do. I tell you unequivocally, I love my country. I've served my country in the military. Everyone in my family has at a time of war. And when you start reading documents like this that are very disturbing of the behavior of your government, it affects you. And it wasn't a pleasant book to do, but I felt I had to do it because I'm now calling our country the United States of hypocrisy. Because we seem to be talking one thing, but the documents prove we're behaving in a completely different manner, virtually opposite the things we talk about. I mean, we speak about peace, and yet we've been at war for over 30 years of my life. And I'll be 60 this summer, and over half of my life we've been at war.
Well, I like to separate our government, the government we love, from the invisible government that runs this country. In other words, there is a visible government, and it's the one that you and I love and respect that stands for freedom. But there is an invisible government there, and this is how I can correlate the two, otherwise it gets sort of schizophrenic. But there really is the invisible government. And you're going to hear about their documents.
Well, whether you call them visible or invisible, it still falls to the elected officials we have I blame the Democratic and Republican parties both equally. They've been in control of the country, at least on the surface, if you look at it that way, for the last century or more. And so they're responsible for the decisions made as elected officials and all of that. And, you know, when you look at some of these documents, they don't paint a pretty picture. It became clear to me now why we have to have such a powerful, big military budget, because our behavior, I can see a lot of countries around the world wouldn't be too pleased with us, as we wouldn't be too pleased if there was a country that behaved the way we have in many ways. You know, and I'm speaking of going back now into the 50s, which we went back with documents that far, where we actually infected people in Nicaragua with syphilis to see if penicillin worked. Well, thank goodness that it did. But had it not worked, they would have died miserable deaths down there. And, you know, that type of behavior. And I feel I have the right to know, because of the fact that I pay taxes, and I have every right to know where my tax dollars go. Now, briefly, the book, we broke it down into an introduction and then into 5 parts. And the parts all have various documents. It's our scandalous post-war history, Part 1. Government, military, and corporate secrets, Part 2. Shady White Houses, we called it, Part 3. Part 4 was completely dedicated to just 9/11, on documents there. And Part 5, the War on Terror. And I think that the good thing about this book is you don't have to read it cover to cover. Each document stands on its own. We reprint the documents in their entirety so you can read them yourself if you want to. I encourage you to, and get your own opinion. But you don't have to read the book in any order. As you go through the index of it, if there's something that jumps out at you, the book is written to where each document stands individually, and so you can read it in whatever order you deem necessary.
Well, we'll get started at the very beginning, because, Chris, I think each part of it is important, because I'm very, very interested in the 9/11, and then, of course, what's happened after that, because, of course, this has been used to expand the power of government over the lives of the people. And, of course, the whole idea is, my goodness, we're at war with terrorism, therefore the American people must give up their freedom. But what happens if this whole thing is contrived and there is an organized effort to convince us there's a war on terrorism so they can take away our freedom and expand the power of the state? Hang on there. We'll be back with all of our stations in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest is Governor Jesse Ventura. So let's start at the very beginning. The book is divided into 5 parts, and the first part is the scandalous post-war history. And he talks about the CIA's secret assassination manual. Now, we don't like to think about the CIA going all over the world assassinating people. And yet, of course, it's a reality. Governor, would you like to touch on that?
It's a startling document. I mean, it's a CIA document. It tells how to assassinate people. It tells the best methods to use. It tells how to get plausible denial. It tells how to cover it up and the best methods to use. And you kind of look at it and you think, really? Well, who makes the call? Who decides who dies out there in the world and for what purpose? Clearly there's no court. There's no law breaking. I guess it's just like James Bond, you assume. They go out and kill each other and have license to kill. I don't know. But, you know, it's called the CIA Secret Assassination Manual. And assassination really is just a political word for first-degree murder, because it's pre-planned, it's done with a purpose, and it's done to change something or whatever, and that's first-degree murder. And I find it just bizarre that an agency of our country could actually print a manual advocating and first-degree murder in any way, shape, or form.
And yet it's been going on for a long time. We know the Church Committee brought out the fact that the CIA had assassinated a number of world leaders. Certainly we know that the book by John Perkins on an economic hitman, Confessions of Economic Hitman, when he worked for the government, he talked about all the government leaders who were assassinated. Chuck Giancano's was Sam Giancano's brother. There, in his book, Double Cross, he talks about all the world leaders that his brother Sam Giancano had coordinated the murders for the CIA. It really does. It is disturbing to think that our tax money is used to kill world leaders who won't go along with the agenda of our invisible government.
Yeah, it really is disturbing because, there's no court here, there's no crime committed. It's just simply someone out there has a different philosophy of government, or someone out there, whatever it may be. I mean, I always kind of laugh at the situation where we have a boycott against Cuba, and yet we have open, and most of our debt is with China. They're both communist countries. Why is one the bad and the other good? And then it comes clear why. Because China welcomes the corporations, and of course Fidel Castro, when he took over Cuba, he kicked them all out. And so it clearly shows that it is the corporations that run our country, and that's who we react to, because that shows you right there we have a boycott against Cuba because they won't allow corporations, and we can't get enough of China, who, of course, does allow corporations. Then you throw in Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. The reason we hate him is because naturally he naturalized Venezuela's oil. He felt strong enough that the people there of his country should profit from their natural resource, and he booted out Exxon. And, that's why our government says the thing that it says all the time about Hugo Chavez. I urge people to watch Oliver Stone's documentary. I think it's entitled South of the Border. It's all about Hugo Chavez, and if you watch this, you may get a completely different feeling about the man than and Oliver shows clearly how he's biased and slandered by our media here against the reality of what the real situation is down there.
Well, let's briefly touch on what really happened at the Gulf of Tonkin, because basically the Gulf of Tonkin incident plunged America into the Vietnam War, and the death of 58,000 American boys, and probably 2 or 3 times that number were crippled and will bear the pain of their wounds until their deaths. And I know you fought in Vietnam.
Well, and let's add probably 1 million Vietnamese or more.
Sure.
Let's not forget the other side. There's always 2 sides to a war. And how many civilian deaths and everything, the collateral damage and everything that go along with it. And basically, what really irks me isn't truly the document itself, although it upsets me. But I was out teaching at Harvard in 2004 when Robert McNamara came through on his tour with his documentary movie where he admitted it didn't happen. And I found that very disturbing, that now you get an admission that there was false flag operations, that our government has used them before, and yet no one thinks that they would use them today. And when you come to find out and look at history, false flag operations are generally used in almost every war to ignite them and get them going. And it is disturbing because you always hear the cliches, if you don't study history, you're destined to repeat it. And it seems we're starting to repeat history within a decade now. It's not even within lifetimes.
I saw one YouTube, and I've forgotten who was interviewing you, but this fellow was saying, well, talking about this book, why, I mean, Governor, after all, I mean, you're suggesting that we haven't been told the truth about what happened on 9/11. I mean, you're not actually suggesting that the government lied and that the terrorists the hijackers didn't take down the buildings. In your reply, do you remember what you said to him?
No, you do so many interviews, they all get mixed together sometimes at times in your brain.
Well, you said, well, they lied to us about Jessica Lintz. They lied to us about Pat Tillman and his death, and they lied to us about what happened at the Gulf of Tonkin. And then you mentioned that you'd been at Harvard when Robert McNamara came through and suddenly admitted it was all a lie, and 58,000 Americans died there unnecessarily. And then you said, and you question, the fact that I questioned what happened on September 11th. They immediately changed the subject. It was such a beautiful, beautiful answer. Indeed.
Well, it's like when I ran for governor. I'll tell you this: when I ran for governor, I never used one prepared speech ever in my entire campaign. And I'll never forget in the first debate I was in, there were probably 8 candidates at the time, and I was seated on the end. They had us alphabetically. And all of them came in with massive amounts of paperwork and books and all this stuff for their spin papers and whatever it was. And I walked in with nothing and sat down on the end. And I remember there was a black woman, civilian, sitting in the crowd, in the audience, very close, though, to my side of the table. And she quietly took a legal pen and slid them across the table to me. And I looked at her and smiled, and I slid them back. And she whispered to me, "Don't you think you'll need that?" And I said, "No, ma'am." I said, "Because when you tell the truth, you don't have to have a good memory." And, and she looked at me and smiled, and I bet I got her vote just with that simple answer, because she understood when you tell the truth, you don't have to remember what you say, because the truth is what it is. And, that's one of the things I had fortunate for me when I ran for governor, is that I ran simply telling the truth, and believe it or not, it worked.
Well, I'd like to ask you to just repeat a story you tell in your previous book about conspiracies, about after you got to be governor. And, of course, one of the first things that happened, you're here there in the State House there, and basically you get a request to meet with someone from the CIA. And would you tell that story? Because I think it is so apropos of what really is going on in America.
Actually, I told that story in 2 books ago, in Don't Start the Revolution Without Me. It wasn't in the conspiracy book. It was in Don't Start the Revolution Without Me, the first book I wrote with Dick Russell. And what it pertained to was I had just taken office, and I received a request to go into, it was before the legislature got in, to go into the bowels of the basement of the Capitol and essentially participate in a CIA, I guess they called it a training exercise, where 23 members of the CIA were waiting for me and subjected me to a variety of questions, but mostly all of them dealing with how did I get elected and questions about my election. And, I cooperated at the time. I didn't really fully understand the power I had as governor. I'd barely been in office, sworn in, but a couple weeks hardly, if even that. And, and I figured it was my duty as a citizen. If the CIA wanted to talk to me, why, of course you talk to them. And so I went down there, but I went as my usual self, and I sat down. They were in a half moon around the room, and the scary thing about them were they were your neighbors. It ran the gambit from young to old, all colors, women who looked like the fat old lady down the block that sweeps her step off, old gentlemen that looked like whatever, the lawnmower repairman up the street. And that's what the scary thing about it was. These people were not Sean Connery and James Bond.
But they put you in a chair in the center of the room, and then they completely surrounded you.
I was in a chair in the half moon in the center, and I said to them, well, before I answer any of your questions, I have a few for you. I said, first off, what are you doing here? I said, your mission statement says you're only to be operational outside the United States. Why are you operational inside? Of which, of course, I didn't receive any type of satisfactory answer. Then I said, I wanted you to go around the room and tell me your name and what you do. Of which, and I'm the governor now, of which maybe half told me their names and maybe half said what they did, but they weren't over cooperative. So I said to them, well, you're not answering my questions. I may not answer some of yours, but go ahead. And they were very cordial. They were very proper. They addressed me as governor in all respectful way, which was fine. Well, when it all got done, and all the questions were about what I did, what we did to get elected. So I went home that night and I called Dick Marcinko. And because I figured Dick would know more than me, and Dick laughed and said, well, he said, I think they wanted to see you because they didn't see you coming. Their job is to predict for the government and all that, and obviously you came in under their radar screen. Or was it the opposite? Did they want to know how I got elected so that they could ensure there would never be an election like mine again.
And they really do, ladies and gentlemen. The CIA determines our elections. They're all rigged as far as I'm concerned. We'll be right back.
Well, mine wasn't.
That's why they were there. That's why they were there, is because you got elected. You weren't supposed to get elected. Well, let's get on. Let's talk a little bit about Operation Northwood, because I think that is such a vitally important document, and you reproduce this. Tell our listeners about Operation Northwood.
Well, what Northwoods was, it was in the early days of the Kennedy presidency, fairly early, although his presidency only lasted about 3 years. But, of course, we were in the bitter battle with Cuba. And the Pentagon and the war machine and everybody wanted an invasion. They were frothing at the bit. They wanted to drive out the communists who had now infiltrated the Cuban island and get them out of our hemisphere and all that stuff. So they wanted to invade, and of course Jack Kennedy came into office and he inherited the Bay of Pigs, which was that invasion that they attempted to do that Kennedy wouldn't support. And it was interesting because initially all the Cubans hated him because they were told that he would support it, but later on they learned that from day one Kennedy said he would not do it, and that they had actually been deceived by the CIA because they'd been sectioned off. I read their book. It's a very interesting book, The Leaders of the Bay of Pigs, and they said they were put in buses and taken to camps where even the windows were blackened out, so they had no contact whatsoever with the news or any type of policy thing, and they were made to believe Kennedy would be there for them when they invaded Cuba with the entire U.S. military or the Navy or whatever in support, when Kennedy all along said he would never do that. So later on, when the Cubans learned that way after the fact, they then embraced Kennedy. When they learned that he got deceived, that they were deceived right along with him. But going back to Northwoods, while all this, the Bay of Pigs and things like that, the military industrial, they wanted to invade Cuba. So they've put forth a scenario to President Kennedy, basically in a nutshell, that our CIA and that our military would attack certain U.S. cities, and they were even going to use some airplane that they were going to shoot down in some manner, and they were going to do all this stuff and make it look like Fidel Castro did it, so that the American public would then rise up and demand an invasion of Cuba, and then they'd have their popular war. And fortunately for us, Jack Kennedy didn't do it. He didn't fall for it. He didn't do Operation Northwoods. I believe the document probably was destined to be destroyed, but somehow it got stuck in the archives, and when Oliver Stone came out with his movie, JFK, of course, there was a big demand at that time. Hey, open up the archives. It's 91. It's been 40 years. Why can't we see this stuff? Or whatever years, 30 years, whatever it'd been at that time. And so as they were going through and discovering many of the documents, up popped Northwoods. And they discovered this document and it got on the Internet. And we were all able to see that this plan had been proposed to President Kennedy, but fortunately he didn't do it. And then when you tie in what it's all about, and you then have to ask the logical question, I believe, if this was on the table in 61, would it not have been on the same thing, been on the table in 2001?
In other words, a phony document that would somehow be used to justify going to war, a war that the American people would never accept unless they were, of course, convinced that we had a terrible enemy that was threatening us. We're going to be back in just a moment with Governor Ventura. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and of course we're talking about Governor Ventura's book. It's entitled 63 Documents the Government Doesn't Want You to Read. We just got a supply of them in today, so the book is available from Radio Liberty. It's an important book, and we certainly encourage you to get it. We were just talking about Operation Northwood, which was a plan, a Joint Chiefs of Staff plan, to come up with some sort of a justification to attack Cuba back in 1962. after the failed Bay of Pigs. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to attack Cuba, and they came up with a whole flock of different plans. One is going to blow up one of our satellites, or blow up our planes, or blow up a boat. It didn't matter what it was, just as long as you could convince the American people that we had to go to war against the wicked Fidel Castro because he had killed a lot of Americans. And yet, of course, he wasn't involved in this at all. It was all to be simply a staged event where we killed a lot of Americans and we could go to war, and the document is right here. You can read it. So let's go fast forward. I mean, remember the 5 sections of this book, and we'll get up to part 4, because I think it's so important that we understand what happened on September 11th. Pardon me, on September 11th, 2001. So let's go to the think tank anticipation of the September 11th attack. What's this think tank?
Well,
did they know the attack was coming?
No, it was a think tank put together by Bush Sr., I believe, and it was at the conclusion of the Cold War with Russia. Russia had fallen, and they wanted to put together a think tank of what would it take to make the United States the sole superpower of the world, now that the Soviet Empire had crumbled. And so this think tank was a bunch of people, Dick Cheney, Wolfowitz, the whole cast of characters of the Bush administration, basically, who was all part of it. And they came up with a massive amount of recommendations of what should happen and what the United States needed to do. And, of course, one of the major things was be in control of Middle Eastern oil. Because oil, China was becoming industrialized, India was becoming industrialized, and they, of course, would want to get their hooks on the oil. Anyone that is industrialized today must have oil. And so in order for us to be the power brokers of that oil, we need to have some type of presence in the Middle East. Now, in this article, or in this study, they stated in the conclusion that to implement everything that they wanted to do would take many, many years. And then in writing it states the only way it could be speeded up was if a Pearl Harbor type of event were to occur.
In other words,
and I think that 9/11 would be classified as a Pearl Harbor type of event.
Absolutely.
And so, and that would speed up what they wanted to, all the things that they felt needed to be implemented in which to make the United States the sole superpower of the world.
And, of course, this is part of a document put forward with the Project for New American Century, and you will read what that document actually says.
Sure.
And let's get into the FBI knowledge of the terrorist training at the flight schools. Basically, of course, we were told why those terrorists were so smart. They outwitted the FBI. They outwitted all of our intelligence agencies. Nobody had any idea this was coming. Condoleezza Rice said, why, who would ever have thought that they would hijack planes and crash them into our buildings? So what's this about? The FBI knew that they were training to...
Well, there was an FBI agent, I believe, in Arizona, who was, with it enough. He paid attention, and he noticed, really, without being part of it, there were massive amounts of Middle Eastern men taking flight lessons and learning how to fly. And so he thought that was a bit peculiar that this was happening in the U.S., so the paperwork is there. He reported this to the FBI headquarters and his superiors, and of course, apparently it was just ignored. Nobody did anything. Nobody followed through on it or anything of that nature. And there's a lot of documents like that. For the U.S. government to say they had no knowledge that 9/11 was on the horizon is a bold-faced lie, because the documents tell and prove otherwise, that if they had been on their toes, they were well warned well ahead of time that there was some strange stuff going on that they probably should have checked into.
But you have a document here about the Standown Order that was in place that morning. In other words, ordinarily, automatically, of course, the fighters would take off without any question if a plane was hijacked or in distress. what's this about a stand-down order? That we've never heard about that.
Well, neither did the 9/11 Commission. They never heard about it either because this document was withheld from them. They were never allowed to see this. And it's the Pentagon stand-down order by an executive order of the president. Up until June 1st.
Hold that thought, please.
Okay.
Well, let's go ahead and get to the stand-down order, because this is really key. Basically, in the past, it was done automatically. There's a plane hijacked, wire fighter planes go up to intercept it, to help it, or to guard our society. But that morning, there was a stand-down order. Please pick up the story there.
Well, the stand-down order already, it actually originated June 1st of 2001 by executive order. Standard operating procedure policies were changed, and I'd like to tell all your listeners that that's the first sign that there's some conspiracy involved in government. The moment standard operating procedures are changed or varied from, because government doesn't do anything without a procedure, whether it's the military or regular government itself. So always look for a change in those procedures, and that's what we had here, the document 46, the Pentagon stand-down order on 9/11. June the 1st of 2001, up until that point, it had been left up to base commanders. If they got a call from the FAA and a plane was in trouble, they made the call. They were given the authority to scramble and fire up the jets. This goes on very often, much more than people realize. Jets are scrambled quite often and go up to check out the skies for whatever purpose or whatever's going on up there. It is not an unusual circumstance. But on June 1st of 2001, that standard order was changed. It was changed that nobody could go airborne without permission from the Pentagon, which means if there's trouble in the sky, you would have to call the Pentagon to get permission. For a stand-down order to occur, all that would have to happen would be Don Rumsfeld not to answer the phone. And that's precisely what happened that day, because there was a period of a few hours where nobody seemed to be able to locate Rumsfeld.
And
that's all documented. And so that's the way the stand-down order. The order was there, and because permission had to come from the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, basically, and they couldn't find Rumsfeld. Therefore, the stand-down order stood and no jets would go into the air.
And that means, of course, they could have stopped the hijacking, they could have prevented the planes from crashing into the buildings, and certainly they could have prevented the attack on the Pentagon.
Now, the unique thing that I always bring up, too, is this massive failure that took place that day. Failure of our intelligence, failure of our air defense system.
Hold that thought, Governor, just for a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and of course, Governor Ventura talks about the fact these are all government documents. That's why this book is so important. It contains all these government documents that have been actively suppressed by what I control, the controlled establishment media. So you're never going to read about them, or everything is done to confuse the American people. But you will actually read the stand-down order put in the 1st of June, that henceforth, contrary to everything we'd always done in the past, if there was an emergency, why, of course, the planes could not be scrambled to find out what was happening. If there was a hijacking or somebody was in danger, it could not be scrambled without checking with the Pentagon, and you'd have to get a clearance from the Donald Rumsfeld. And on September 11th, Donald Rumsfeld was nowhere to be found, and that, of course, why there was no planes in the air. That's why, of course, the planes, hijacked planes, were able to crash into the Twin Towers. But then, of course, the next question is, did those planes bring down the Twin Towers? And then there's another document on that, because basically the buildings fell at the speed of gravity. You could not do that because there'd be ordinarily resistance is falling at the speed of gravity. In other words, something happened to the internal structure of those buildings, so each floor collapsed in order. Would you like to cover that? Because that is key to this whole discussion. What really happened that day? We saw the planes, at least the plane hit the South Tower that day, and then we saw the plane hit the North Tower when they had the films available the next following day. But did the planes hitting the buildings bring the buildings down?
Well, first of all, if I may, let's back up a little bit to what we talked about on the Standown Order and the catastrophic failure that took place that day from our intelligence community, our air defense, and all that. Here's a key thing. How come nobody got fired or lost their jobs? I will tell you this. If I were the governor, I was the governor of Minnesota, if I would have been the president and there would have been this type of catastrophic failure to defend our country, I come from the Navy SEALs, where failure is not an option. If you can't get the job done, you're gone. It's that simple. And I would assume that air defense operates the same way. How come no one was fired that day? How come no one lost their job? In fact, people were promoted.
This certainly happened with the CIA, In fact, George Bush congratulated them for the fine job they did immediately after the 9/11 attack. And I could never figure out why they did such a good job that day.
Well, and that's precisely it. See, why you don't fire someone? And I can tell you this, had I been the president, heads would have rolled. People would have lost their jobs after 9/11 because you can't, again, failure is not an option. But the reason no one got fired, in my opinion, is because when you start firing people, that's when investigations happen. That's when people start starting to talk, because nobody wants to be scapegoated. Nobody wants to lose their job. But if you keep everything in place, when Monday comes, business as usual, everybody moves on, and there's never really an investigation of anything that would go on. Now, moving forward to what brought the buildings down, I don't believe certainly their explanation is valid at all, the pancake effect, because it defies the laws of physics. If you took a billiard ball and merely dropped it from the free fall from the height of the World Trade Center to the ground, and if you merely stopped it and started at every floor with no resistance, like what they're telling us happened with this pancake effect, it would take the billiard ball literally a minute and a half to reach the ground. These buildings were down in 10 seconds, and in the case of Building 7, I believe it was about 7 seconds or whatever, even quicker. And so even the government's document, 47, the free fall of Building 7, in their document, they use the word free fall, which is an admission. The only way you can have a free fall of a building like that is to, at all time, remove all resistance, all at one time, so that the building can fall the same way as I used to jump out of airplanes, at a free fall speed. And so to say that the floors rammed into each other where a moving object hit one that was not moving defies the laws of physics. And you can't defy the laws of physics. They are what they are. They are science. And that alone, the simplicity of that, and yet the American public completely bought this. And they always refer to Popular Mechanics magazine explained it. Well, how can they explain defying the laws of physics?
Well, because of course nobody ever wants to challenge it. I will have to admit that after the fall of the buildings, I did not want to believe that our government had brought them down. I realized because they knew the attack was coming, I did not want to believe it. And it wasn't until I watched Building 7 come down half a dozen times over and over on television, saw the center of the roof collapse first, and then the base of the building. Of course, you collapse the center of the building, so the walls fall in. You suddenly come to the horrible realization that they've really killed all those people that day. They knew exactly what they were doing, because if Building 7 was a controlled demolition, then everything was a controlled demolition.
Well, wait a minute now, though. There's a problem that I've discovered since writing this book about lumping it into a controlled demolition. And here's the problem. First of all, when you do a controlled demolition, the smoke never rises any higher than the original heights of the buildings. In 9/11, the smoke went up into the atmosphere. Second, the toasted cars down on the street. How do you explain that even with a controlled demolition? That over 1,000 cars in Manhattan, as far away as the FDR, which is over by the East River, and the trade towers are by the Hudson, cars were toasted, burnt, exploded into fire. How does a controlled demolition do that?
Well, there's a lot of unanswered questions, and certainly we've never had an independent investigation, that's for sure. Well, maybe if we could get you in as president, why, we would get an independent investigation.
Well, I would tell you, literally, I would say right now, if I did become the president, I would certainly open up 2 investigations again. I would put my Justice Department on the murder of Kennedy and do what the committee recommended they did way back in the 70s. And I would likewise open up 9/11 and do a real investigation. You want to know why you know the 9/11 investigation was a fraud?
Why?
Oh, here's why. You remember Whitewater when they investigated Bill Clinton
Sure.
for the stuff in Arkansas and all that?
Right.
Well, they spent $100 million, and ultimately in the end they learned that the president cheated on his wife, right? $100 million. Do you know how much they allocated to initially investigate 9/11?
I know. What, 4 or 5 million? It was
$4 million.
4 million.
Now it went to about 12, but $4 million. You can't even. That shows you right there. They were not serious about doing any investigation whatsoever. I spoke to a woman who was on the 9/11, worked on it as a lawyer. She said they were given orders that they were to back nothing unless it was unanimous. Well, anything put in their report had to be unanimous by all the commissioners. Anything that wasn't unanimous was left out.
And I think anything significant was left out. I mean, that was the thing. They actually interrogated 1,200 people in private sessions. They interviewed 100 in public sessions, and then the other 1,100 testimonies were sealed for 50 years. And I never understood why they wanted to seal them if there wasn't something to conceal.
Exactly. Well, it's no different than what they did with Lee Harvey Oswald and with the Kennedy killing, where they seal everything up and we're not allowed to see it. And that's another sign that something isn't kosher, something isn't right. You know, why? If the truth is and everything is what it is, then why would they have to seal up anything? And I always said that about Oswald. If Oswald was who they said he was, this little disgruntled private, I should say, who became Marxist-Leninist and killed our president for that purpose, why would anything from a private have to be sealed up because of national security? What would a private know?
Well,
I mean, I was a petty officer 3rd class with a top secret security clearance in the Navy SEALs, and I didn't know that much. I knew a few little things, but at that level, you're not made privy to that much.
Well,
so that tells you it's a fraud right there.
Well, it's not trying to conceal what Lee Harvey Oswald knew. It's trying to conceal what the government knows about Lee Harvey Oswald and what happened that day.
Well, the other thing you can't get, believe it or not, even today, you can't get Oswald's tax return.
Isn't that interesting?
And people might say, well, why would you want his tax return? Well, if on his tax return he was under employment of our government, wouldn't that change the whole thing?
Well, I have no question that he was working for both the FBI and the CIA.
Exactly. And if that showed on his tax return, then they couldn't sell Lee Harvey Oswald, could they?
No, they sure couldn't.
That's why they have to keep his tax return under wraps.
Well, let's get on to
Sure.
the Justice Department's secret plan on the war on terror, because I think that's very, very important. What was the Justice Department's secret plan for the war on terror?
Well, I'll tell you, you're picking out, I got to pass on that one. I'd have to reread it again.
All right, then we'll let you get
I'm on to my next book, so this is like review for me in its own way when you do these book tours. And again, I don't want to make excuses, but I will anyway. Cripe, I've done so many interviews in the last 3 days, and to get my brain going this late at night by throwing all the individual documents at me, I got to tell you, I can't. Some of them I would have to review again and reread them before I would want to speak on them, because I don't want to say something that's untrue or something that wouldn't be viable to the subject without knowing it real well.
Okay, well, if you
the
don't want
I'd like to talk about there, though.
All right, you go right ahead, then. You pick this up.
How about 57, 58, and 59?
You go right ahead. 57, 58, and 59. That's
the paper trail
trail
of the CIA's destruction of 92 torture videos. Now, isn't that lovely? Now, I'm a taxpayer, so I paid for these videos, right? So I think I have a right to see them. Now, I'm being sarcastic, I'm going to tell you that, and cynical. But what would be better on a Friday night when you got nothing to do than watch a few torture videos? Don't you think that'd be a good, entertaining thing to do on a Friday?
They do not want the American people to really be able to see that because, pictures worth 1,000 words, and the horror of what our government has done, and that George Bush authorized and encouraged why some of the Christians in our population might realize that maybe George Bush was not the noble, gentle Christian he's been portrayed to be by our Christian leaders.
Absolutely. I mean, he admitted in his book that he authorized the torture. And by the way, just so your listeners will know, I've been waterboarded. So I know what it is, and it is torture. I was waterboarded at what they call SEER School, Survival, Escape, Resistance, Evasion. It was required by all services back in the old days. If you were going in the combat zone of Vietnam, you had to complete that course. And during the completion of that course, which was a week long, everybody essentially was waterboarded. And it is torture. And I don't know if you know this, but every year Yale University has a list of their top 10 quotes. And a couple years ago I made it. And it was a quote that I gave on Larry King when this torture issue was up. I said, Larry, you give me Dick Cheney 1 hour in a waterboard, and I'll get him to confess to the Sharon Tate murders.
Well, but you're never going to get your hands on Dick Cheney, although I wish you could. But be that as it may, basically we have the. Do you feel comfortable on the World Bank report on drugs or the State Department take on drug money leaving Afghanistan?
Well, I know it pretty well, but the one I'd rather hit is the RAND report.
You go right ahead, then. We'll stick with the
last document is the RAND report.
Okay, fine.
Now, this is a professional group of people that our government generally follows, their recommendations. They go to the RAND people quite often. But on terrorism, they decide they're not going to bother with the RAND people, the RAND report. Because the RAND report shows that through all the discovery and research they do, which is what they do there, they do research and figure out the best odds for things. Excuse me. Only a 7% success rate using the military to combat terrorism. 7%. It's 40% using intelligence and 40% good regular police work. Only 7% success using military. And yet we have put all our eggs into that basket. We go over, invade countries, and occupy them in which to fight terrorism, in which the RAND report shows there's only a 7% success rate involving the military.
Well, obviously, we're there for a far different reason that we're telling the American people.
It would seem that way, wouldn't it?
And an awful lot of American boys have died needlessly. Today we have 246,000 people in Afghanistan. That's 90,000 American troops, 110,000 contractors, 46,000 NATO troops, and there are between 50 and 100 members of Al-Qaeda there, according to Leon Panetta. I know Leon. I ran against him for Congress some years ago. And between 50 and 100 members of Al-Qaeda, 246,000 troops. What's wrong with this picture? Well, what are some of the other issues you'd like to bring up from the list?
Well, I'd like to talk a moment to expose Afghanistan.
You go right ahead.
And it's not in the book.
You go right ahead.
About 6 months ago it was, I saw in the paper, and it explained to me completely why we're in Afghanistan. And what I saw in the paper was a report where they said they just discovered, which I found laughable. I guess they want me to believe that a Marine was on patrol and he maybe tripped over this. But they said they just discovered a vein of lithium that could be worth $1 trillion there. The mineral wealth in Afghanistan apparently is unbelievable. Now you ask lithium, why would that be worth $1 trillion? Well, every cell phone, computer, and soon-to-be electric cars will require lithium for their batteries. That tells me, as a Vietnam veteran, why we are in Afghanistan. We're there to get the lithium.
Well, as we often say, reality is usually scoffed at. Illusion is usually king. And ladies and gentlemen, an awful lot of people have died unnecessarily in this totally unnecessary war. All, in my opinion, I think Governor Ventura would agree, it is a totally manipulated war. We're not fighting terrorism over there. They're using the war on terrorism to take the freedom away from the American people. Our guest has been Governor Jesse Ventura. Hang on, we've got just a couple of moments here when I want to get Governor Ventura's website, and we'll be back in just a moment to wrap up the program. Well, Governor, do you have a website, any information you'd like to get out?
Well, I actually do have a website. I will admit I'm computer ignorant. My son runs it, which is a good person to have a young person do it. They know computers far better than us old stubs do.
We have the same thing in our family. Go right ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, anyway, my website is all one word, weaintgottimetobleed.com. And I'm going to shamelessly promote my T-shirt on there. It has Jesse Ventura with a quote that I want in the world today, and that is this. You can get a T-shirt, one of mine, that says, I love my country, not my government.
And I think we have to separate the two. I think it's a very important
difference. Most definitely we do. And I do it on my T-shirts, but I will be speaking on my website and updating it weekly. And really, as time goes on, the website will probably be the best place you'll actually hear me and talk to me in the future, because my days with the media are drawing to a close, and I may just do it via my website much more than I do talking to regular media.
What about the Truth TV? I mean, those are wonderful, wonderful programs.
I don't know right now. Again, let me state this. I'm amazed we got them on TV.
I am too.
When we were doing the first set of 7 or 8, whatever it was, I had a gentleman's bet with my crew, cast and crew. I said, we're going to do all these, but in the 11th hour, they're not going to show them. But lo and behold, they did. It was amazing. And we only got one censored. That was last year with the police state dealing with the FEMA camps. That obviously hit a chord with the government that they didn't want out there. But the status now is I don't know. My son who works on the show just got put back on the payroll. That's a good sign. Everybody is telling me it's going to be up for 8 more episodes again. But here's the problem. My contract is up, and no one has approached me yet about renewing my contract. So maybe they're going to move ahead without Jesse Ventura. I don't know.
I sure hope they don't. I was on one of those that went on, I think it was on population control. And I met your crew. I met the beautiful woman that you have, the black woman. She was just lovely. It was
the one from Guyana.
Right.
Yeah.
I love it, Rex. Well, anyway, thank you so very much for being with us, Governor. It's been a pleasure. I hope and pray, I will tell you the people all across America want to see the next series on Truth TV, and if it does, why we'll give you all the coverage that you possibly can get. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Our guest has been Governor Jesse Ventura. His book, 63 Documents the Government Doesn't Want You to Read, available from Radio Liberty. God bless. Good night. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and of course, our guest has been Governor Jesse Ventura. The book, of course, is 63 Documents the Government Doesn't Want You to Read, and of course we have that, as well as his previous book and his previous book on the conspiracy. So we have two books by Jesse Ventura. You need to read both of them. They're vitally important. And then, of course, we hope that you'll maybe even want to get a copy of this tape, this CD, of this program. You need to hear it a couple of times, and there's so much more in the book that we didn't have time to cover. But this is the time I need to remind our listeners out across America, indeed all across the world, because through the miracle of the Internet, these programs are heard in every nation in the world. If you would in a position to support Radio Liberty, we could certainly use your help. We need to expand our coverage and get more stations, but before we do, we have to be secure in what we have. We have over 60 outlets now every single week, and our programs are heard certainly on 60 outlets every week. And we are reaching people who have no idea what's going on. And many of them, of course, have taken to heart the message, because we point out that we're involved in a spiritual battle being played out on a political and ideological battlefield. So if you are in a position to help, give us a call at 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. And if you're not in a position to help, then please pray for Radio Liberty, for our provision and our protection. We've got a couple of great, DVDs on weather control. What, of course, gets into the geoengineering of the atmosphere. It's entitled, What in the World Are They Spraying? We have another DVD called Weather Modification, Method of Weather Warfare by Bob Fletcher. Just ask for Bob Fletcher's DVD on weather control. We have a 4-tape set on weather control, a 4-CD set. We have a 4-CD set on HARP. We have a 4-CD set on chemtrails. We actually have a book on weather modification, weather warfare. We have a book on HARP. And you must understand they have the ability to modify the weather, to create storms, to create droughts, to create tornadoes, to create hurricanes, to create earthquakes. They know exactly what they're doing. They just don't want you to know what they're doing. They want you to believe that all the things we're seeing have to do with climate change and, the carbon footprint, and that's why we've got to deindustrialize America and do away with electricity, and we can't have electricity from nuclear because, of course, we might get another Japanese episode. We can't have electricity from burning of oil, coal, or natural gas because that increases the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We can't have electricity from hydroelectric because that actually keeps the little fishies from swimming up and down the rivers. And basically, then, of course, we'll have to rely upon the wind and certainly on the sun, and we're going to have to deindustrialize America. Ladies and gentlemen, these people know what they're doing. They just don't want you to know. You need to get our material on sustainable development, our syllabus, our DVD, and you need to get my 4-tape set. You need to get our material on population control. They really do intend to kill off most of the world's population. The talks are planned population reduction, none dare call it genocide, or simply population control. You need to get our sustainable development syllabus because it has so many of the documents in it. Their documents, not our documents, their documents, that tell you that they plan to kill off most of the people in the world. We're dealing with ruthless, tyrannical forces. Our number, 1-800-544-8927. Be sure to order Jesse Ventura's 63 document that the government doesn't want you to read. 1-800-544-8927.